So, Peter, I want to start with you and ask you about really what was the crux of your feature, which is that Donald Trump treats his allies as disposable. So, which allies has Trump threatened to dump over the years and why?
Well, apart from the non-defence treaties that he's cancelled, just looking strictly at the defence treaties he's got with allies, security treaties, he's famously said that he'll tear up NATO, that he'll walk away from NATO allies if they don't, quote, pay up, unquote. But he hasn't stopped at NATO, and people think that that's involved with his rather surreal attachment to Vladimir Putin. To ingratiate himself with Vladimir Putin, he would effectively explode the NATO alliance so that Putin would have free rein to attack Europe as he pleases. But he's gone beyond that, so it's not just about Russia and NATO. He's also threatened to walk out on the US treaty with Japan and with South Korea if they also, quote, don't pay, unquote. Or you could almost say it's an unlimited appetite to break agreements and offend and upset allies. And of course he's demeaned Canada, a fellow NATO member. He knows no limits.
And why? What's at the heart of this, that he's sort of happy to take or leave, these traditional allies of his?
Well, on the bright side, on the happy side, you could say he's simply trying to hold them to their side of the treaty bargain. It shouldn't all be about free riding on American spending, American GIs. Why should American soldiers be the only ones to die and American taxpayers the only one to pay up? And it has had some effect. Trump's jawboning has moved some of the European members of NATO to lift their defence spending. Since 2006, they've all promised to spend at least 2% of their GDP equivalent on defence. Very few of them had. Trump started to hector them and lecture them to raise their spending to 2%. That plus the very salutary effect of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has now got 18 of the 31 members, European members, to cough up to the 2% mark. And collectively, the European members are now spending over 2%. So, it has had some beneficial effects. If you think that a defence treaty should be a two-way street, then that is perfectly justifiable. What doesn't add up is, while he's tough on his allies, he is not only lenient but permissive to America's enemies. I don't know whether they're Trump's enemies, but they're America's enemies. Russia, China, North Korea. He encourages them. He says that where he hates countries such as Japan and South Korea let's focus on Japan because this has been his obsession since the mid-'80s when he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. He was a businessman, but he felt so strongly about it, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to complain about Japan and its massive trade surplus with the US, robbing the US. Right. So this has been a long-running preoccupation. And to stop this being too long-running an answer, I'll cut to the main point, that he has said that while he hates Japan for having rorted America and taken advantage, as he put it, of its trade agreement, its trade with the US, where China has done the same thing. China has a massive trade surplus with the US. That he respects China. He said, China's taken advantage of the US and I respect them for that. So he loathes and is angry at an ally for doing that, yet respects an enemy for doing that. That is the jarring point. That's the tell that tells you that he's not interested in allies. He seems to dislike and disrespect and even despise allies. And yet he respects, likes, and even invites potential aggression from America's enemies. This is the jarring point.
Which makes me want to bring you in here, Matt, because just before recording, you introduced me to a political theory I had actually not heard of before. It's the madman theory of diplomacy. So I'm just wondering, is there a perspective that perhaps Trump's mercurial nature has a benefit?
This is the most generous possible interpretation of Trump's approach to diplomacy and foreign affairs, but there might be something to it. Now, this really started with the presidency of Richard Nixon, and he deployed this very deliberately during the Cold War and also during the Vietnam War, that he would get his advisors to say, Nixon's really mad, he's crazy, we can't control him, he could do anything, he could use nuclear weapons, we're trying to hold him back, but you've got to cut us some slack. This came up at the end of the Vietnam War. And the theory is that by not being predictable, by not being stable, you keep everyone off balance and they're not sure what to do. So you'd remember in the first Trump presidency, he would go on Twitter and threaten to go to war. He would threaten to rain rockets down on North Korea.
Yep.
And everyone was so unsure about what he was up to and what he would do. There is a theory that restrained some of America's enemies from doing anything significant. It was a pretty benign time in international relations, the early part of his presidency. Now, that could be luck. Luck always plays a role. But you look at the situation now, there's a war in Ukraine, there's a war in Gaza. The Biden administration, while being praised from many aspects, has been criticized, say, in Ukraine, for being so careful, so deliberate, not wanting to have any kind of escalation, having all these red lines of what they will and won't give to Ukraine, that maybe that's allowed Putin to play a long game and perhaps potentially get what he wanted from the war. So that's the generous theory, is that Trump will come back into office and everyone will be, including, say, Xi Jinping and China, will be so unsure about his intentions that they'll hold back for a bit.
Not to mention the fact that since Trump was last in power, China has sort of upped its aggression considerably, hasn't it, in the Indo-Pacific? And of course, it continues to build up its military. I think it's the world's largest. So what's the feeling here among the people that you speak to, Peter, about, that Trump won't support us? Should we come into conflict with China?
I think it's generally agreed, but very quietly agreed by everybody in government and opposition in any position of responsibility, that it is a real risk that Australia would be left on its own under a Trump administration. This is probably a good attribute of Trump's, but only up to a point, and that is he does not want to engage, based on what he said at least, does not want to engage in any wars, doesn't want to start any wars. He boasted that he had never started a war during his first presidency. This is also of a piece with Barack Obama. Obama used to brag that, quote, "I am the president who ends wars." So this is the new phase in America, disillusioned with its ridiculous war in Iraq. It's long-winded and failed war and occupation in Afghanistan. This is a country that's walked away from the whole concept of American adventurism overseas. And Trump is just an extension and perhaps a magnification of that impulse. People who've worked for Trump in the White House tell me that he has a particular terror of nuclear war, and I would suggest that it's probably a perfectly normal human response. Yeah. However, when you are the commander of the world's largest nuclear force, which exists as a deterrent, it doesn't exist as a weapon of assault, but a weapon of defence and response, and that we are one of the nearly 40 countries that shelter under that nuclear umbrella, allowing us to maintain no nuclear capability to deter our enemies. You would want somebody who is prepared to be serious about deterring potential enemies. What's the point of the entire US military, including its nuclear arsenal, if it's not going to deter? If you're not deterring, it means you're reacting, and potentially under attack or engaged elsewhere. Your treaties, your weaponry, your arsenals have to be credible. If they're not credible, they're not deterring. If they're not deterring, they're inviting aggression from others.
I was just going to add that it is a fascinating discussion, Trump and China, because you hear very different things from people. His real obsession with China in his first term and throughout his career was an economic one, and that China is stealing American jobs. They've all been shipped over there. They're overtaking us. America's no longer the biggest superpower in the world. And that was the focus in his presidency, was putting tariffs on Chinese goods and looking to cut a big deal with Xi Jinping. And this was all coming to a head just before the coronavirus pandemic. So the question has always been, would Trump trade away important issues. For example, how much does he really care about democracy in Taiwan, human rights in China? I don't think these are the things that really get him going. It's about American jobs. So there's always been the possibility, could he do a big deal with China and not focus on some of these other aspects? But then there's also the issue, many of the people surrounding him are very hawkish on China in the last administration and likely in a next one. They're very committed. There have been articles for example, by Matt Pottinger, who served as a senior advisor in the previous administration, essentially arguing that America should be pursuing regime change in China. This is the world in Washington right now that Trump's existing in. So it will be fascinating to see if a second Trump presidency comes to pass, how he would balance out the economic and national security aspects of the China relationship.
Which brings us all, Matt, to the focus of your piece, which of course is about AUKUS. This is the defense pact that we have with the United States and the United Kingdom. And so I wanted to ask you, what would a re-elected Trump do with the AUKUS pact, given that this is, of course, one of Joe Biden's major initiatives?
And this is probably the primary issue for Australia in terms of what Trump will do relating specifically to us. The AUKUS agreement has made us very, very dependent on the United States. We're already very dependent on the United States military, as Peter was discussing before with the ANZUS Treaty. But as part of this deal that the Albanese government announced last year, Australia is planning to acquire at least 3 Virginia-class submarines from America. That's to fill up what is really rapidly opening up a big gap in our submarine capability. And we've basically bet everything we've got on this arrangement with America. But for it to come to pass, it will need successive administrations to support it and to drive it forward and to make it happen. America is struggling to produce enough submarines for itself. In fact, it's not producing nearly as much as it wants to. And now it's going to give some to Australia. Well, by give, I mean sell at quite a high price. Yes. And so a big question has been, what will Trump do about AUKUS? And we haven't had a clear indication. As you say, it was a Joe Biden initiative. That is a worrying thing for Australia because in his first term, Trump showed particular delight in tearing up agreements by his predecessor, Barack Obama. So would he do the same again here? Many experts I've spoken to, including, for example, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who met with Trump recently during his visit to America, they think that Trump will stick with AUKUS. They think there are many reasons why he will see it as a good deal for America. We are paying billions of dollars into America to help their production lines. The laws actually had to be changed in America to allow this to happen. So it shows that how unusual this is. No other country has said, let's give you some money to help you build submarines.
Money, US $4.5 billion, I think it is.
Yes, I think Australian.
So it's only
US
Australian 4.5 billion.
US $3 billion.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that still remain, even if Trump does sign up to AUKUS, is he sees himself as a master negotiator, as a deal maker. Would he, this is something that some people put to me, is would he say, well, Biden got $3 billion from the Australians. Why don't we get 6? They can pay us more. They're on the hook here. If we don't give them these submarines, then they're going to be left high and dry. So Trump is a volatile character. He's an unpredictable character. We're never going to be resting easy with him on this, even if he does get asked at a press conference, do you support AUKUS? And he says yes.
And you made the point, I think, quite colorfully in your piece that perhaps, Matt, appealing to Trump's sentimental side about our long-standing mateship with the United States is not going to be the way to win him over. Why is that, Matt?
Well, this was a discussion. It's about how do you deal with Trump? It was interesting, Peter talking about Japan before, which Trump had a long-standing pretty negative view of. I think the late Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was seen as one of the most effective leaders in dealing with Trump. He was incredibly energetic, just turned on this charm offensive.
Right.
And actually, while maybe not changing Trump's base views, Japan and the US had quite a good relationship because of the way he courted Trump very actively. So people do note in this space that with Trump, you can't rely on very formal, traditional diplomacy. Joe Hockey, previous ambassador, played golf with Trump. It's a more informal way of going about it. Some people have even floated the idea of, oh, well, you should show up with Trump and give him a gold-plated statue of an AUKUS submarine to put on his mantle, because that's something he can look at and get. He's a very visual person. So we will need energetic and perhaps creative diplomacy to keep this deal on track.
Right, okay. And so, Peter, I want to turn to you now, because it is quite telling, isn't it, that we're even talking with some trepidation about how to handle a U.S. president that perhaps we can never be quite sure will be on his good side. So tell me, is there actually a precedent for this, for a world leader who treats their allies like this?
Well, yes, there are many. In recent history, for example, one that comes to mind is China only has one treaty ally, one formal treaty ally, and that's North Korea, which goes back to their shared communist origins. But Xi Jinping detests North Korea. The president of China loathes and detests the country, its systems, and its leader, Kim Jong-un. So in his first 5 years, his first term as president of China, he refused to meet Kim Jong-un, and there was no contact. It was very frosty indeed. So he didn't break the treaty, but there was no life to the treaty at all. And of course, history is replete with leaders breaking treaties. Famously, perhaps most famously in modern history, was the Munich Agreement of 1938 that was supposed to guarantee, as Neville Chamberlain called it, peace in our time, when he signed with Hitler. Of course, it was just a year later that World War II broke out, and Hitler dismissed the Munich Agreement as, quote, just a scrap of paper, unquote. So, and they were treaty allies. Britain, France, Germany were treaty allies under the Munich Agreement, and suddenly they weren't. And we could go all day, but going back to the Versailles Treaty, for example, that was supposed to wrap up World War I, was supposed to impose conditions particularly on Germany, and restrain it from future aggression. But the Americans proposed this thing to enforce the Treaty of Versailles called the League of Nations, the forerunner of the UN today, of course, which sounded fine, except that when push came to shove, the US refused to join or ratify its own initiative, the League of Nations. The US wouldn't touch it. As a result, the Treaty of Versailles was useless, leading to a serial failure of treaties, restraints, and ultimately it's often been connected with the failure ultimately of the Munich Agreement itself. So, the key point I suppose here, Samantha, is this: no treaty is greater or stronger than the political will of the two governments currently enforcing it. And that is why Trump is such an unknown, such a risk, because the political will behind his interest in treaties seems to be hovering somewhere close to zero.
It's sobering. Sorry, I'm just going to have to take a moment there. When you
pause,
when you hark back to Hitler and the Munich Agreement.
Every argument, if it goes long enough, eventually brings up Hitler.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
we've been arguing too long.
That's exactly right. Now, just to wrap up, I guess I wanted to ask you both, Peter, I'll start with you, about what Mike Green has said. He's an expert who worked in the George W. Bush administration. You've both interviewed him. And I know when we spoke about what he said, I think it was 3 months ago on this podcast, and he'd said to you, if Trump wins in November, it'd be terrible, but not as terrible as people think. So I wanted to ask you, why is this? And I'll go to you, Peter, first. If you agreed then, do you agree that this is still the case now?
Yeah, well, it'll be terrible, he said, but not as terrible as you thought. Well, It depends on your expectations and how low they are. Yeah. Look, probably he's right, because we've let our imaginations, collectively, the world, let our imaginations go wild on Trump, and he encourages that. I'd just say that Mike's consolations were pretty lukewarm. For example, he said, Trump hates the Europeans because they're associated with progressive politics and, loose laws and the weakening of the state and pro-abortion and all the stuff that he loathes. or is supposed to loathe at least. And you guys don't have that problem. So he doesn't hate us as much as he hates Europe. Well, that's not much of a consolation.
Low bar.
Low
Okay,
bar.
yeah, okay. Matt, over to you.
I think Mike's diagnosis is probably right, as in even for a US president, there are various constraints on the way they can operate. He's going to be constrained by Congress, perhaps by the Supreme Court as well, although there's a bit of a question mark over that. I was going to say, it's one thing to note is that it's a different time from his first administration. That was when we had a conservative coalition government. This time we have a centre-left Labor government that's interested in issues like climate change that Trump has absolutely no interest in pursuing at all. So there will be a different aspect to the relationship, and it'll be fascinating to see how someone like Anthony Albanese, who's been critical of Trump in the past, as many Australian leaders and politicians have, would handle that relationship. Everything will not be the same as the first time. Australia did pretty well out of Trump. The first time we got exemptions from various tariffs. Can we expect that to continue again? Or perhaps he'll say, oh no, I've done what I'm going to do for Australia economically. We can't expect it to be the same as the first time around. It's going to be a very wild ride.
Okay, well, I know that I'll have to speak to you both again about this because obviously this is something that's going to be on a lot of our minds. So thank you so much, Peter and Matthew, for your time.
Pleasure, Samantha, but I think it's a dead end. There's no interest in Donald Trump
that's
anymore.
Right. No, that's right. That's right. No one wants to talk about him. No. The headlines don't generate reader interest. It's true. It's true.
It's a dead issue.
Yeah.